All around the world, there's been an increase in the practice of spiritism, fortune-telling, witchcraft, and Satanism. This video seeks both to warn and inform the viewer about the possible dangers of any involvement with the occult.
Do you know your birth sign? Do you follow the stars? Believing in bad luck and superstition. Predictions in your horoscope beginning to come true. Without it, you don't want to make decisions. No one knows the future, so don't believe the lie. Astrologers are tools in Satan's hands. Ouija boards and tarot cards are more than harmless fun. They are the doorway that will lead you to distraction. Come into my parlor, send the spider to the floor. There are many pleasures. Do you want to try?
People like us Christian ministers are having to counsel youngsters time and time again. They get involved with the soft stuff, the horoscopes, the tarot cards, the Ouija boards. It draws them into this power that they don't understand, they can't control. And suddenly, they're lost. Their personalities disintegrate, and they go from bad to worse, and they lose the ability to be people in their own right and to make choices.
We've got 5 minutes to get a rehearsal in before a cup of tea, so let's get going.
And by the time you arrive, it's back. You have to...
Hey, you know, it's incredible, isn't it, the amount of people we've actually met along the way who've needed to have been set free from involvement in the occult and other practices.
I know, it's incredible.
I mean, do you remember that girl up north we met?
That's right, yeah, she was absolutely ensnared by it. You know, she just had a simple seance in her house because she thought it was just some fun, you know, something fun to do. And the television exploded, things started flying around the room. And since that night, she actually had nightmares. And what was happening was the nightmares were coming true the next day.
So, like there was a motorway accident.
Right, that's
and
right.
She also dreamt that her sister had hurt herself, and the next day she did.
That's right.
It's amazing how they get drawn
She was
in.
in some state. She was in tears. She was crying. She was in school when I met her, and she was really upset about it all.
Behaviour and her character.
She didn't even know if she could go to sleep at night because she was so scared. She was going to dream something about her family that would come true the next day. You know.
It reminds me of a teacher down in the south who actually, in a religious education class, actually taught the kids there various things like fortune telling and the horoscopes and the superstition behind that.
Well, even like simple things like, you know, that survey we took just recently about reading your horoscopes. I couldn't believe how many people just read their horoscope every day. We were at a Christian camp and it was just like more read their horoscope than actually read the Bible. It was incredible. And yet it's just subtle, isn't it? And people get into the, you know, like into the supernatural thing of it and don't actually realise that that kind of thing can be dangerous.
It's the beginning of other things. There was a survey about 2 or 3 years ago in the north, and amongst teenagers, 87% of those questioned had actually dabbled in the occult, and half of them actually in the Ouija board, probably lunchtimes, you know, like in the library, just, you know, every day is just a bit of fun. But half of them had dabbled in the Ouija board. For many people, it's a natural part of life.
A little while ago, I was asked to go to a school in Cambridgeshire to teach RI for 2 weeks. I said I would go and happily join the staff, and we had a good time. But during the 2 weeks, they asked me specifically, would I speak at one of their general study periods on the occult. I said it was not a subject I liked to tackle, but I would do, provided there were senior members of staff present, so they knew the kind of things that I was sharing. And we had a very good hearing. When we'd finished the session and I went back to the staff room. I'm sitting in the staff room having a cup of coffee, when suddenly there's a disturbance outside. People come running into the staff room and say, "Come quick." And I went out into the foyer of the school, and there is a young lady, clearly demented, screaming. Part of her body is paralysed, and beside herself, and the confusion that reigned with children running everywhere. Recognising what this was, I stepped in and got hold of her and took her very quickly out from the foyer of the school and through a door and onto the field, which was just adjacent. I stood her there, and now she was uncontrollably shouting and screaming. I said to her, "I don't know what has caused this. I don't know who you believe in, but I am telling you that Jesus is Lord. And in the name of Jesus, come out of her." And at that moment, she shook from head to foot and then stood calm. I said to her, "Could you explain what has happened?" She said, "Well, on Saturdays I have a part-time job with a hairdresser. And this hairdresser, I found out, was a spiritist medium. Progressively, without meaning to, I got a little involved with her and what she was doing. And then somehow, for some reason, in that period we had this afternoon, it suddenly sparked."
It started when I was about 15 years old. I'd been messing about with Ouija boards with the other kids at school, and really found it interesting, the whole thing about the occult and stuff like that. And then a girl that I knew gave me this book. It was a small paperback book, and it was just a book about witchcraft, a do-it-yourself guide to witchcraft, really. And I read the book and found it really interesting. And so after giving it a fair amount of thought, I decided that was something that I wanted to follow and look into. And so I suppose round about the age of 16, I began to take a real unhealthy interest in witchcraft.
What sort of things attract young people?
I would say that the biggest influence on young people today is books and videos, because they're the most accessible. Fantasy involvement games, that's another area as well that poses a very great threat to sucking people into the occult. Anything that's got a high level of mystic content, talking about witches, wizards, Dungeons and Dragons, stuff like that, occult videos about witchcraft and demonology, all these things spark off interest in people.
So what about the increasing popularity of Halloween?
Halloween is the highest satanic festival of the year, and it's the night when all the forces of darkness empower Satanists and witches for the coming year. I mean, it really is a high satanic festival, and yet a majority of people just accept it as being trick-or-treat, apple dunking and party time. But that's what's going on underneath it. Halloween trick-and-treat is just a very, very acceptable veneer for something far, far more sinister.
Kevin Logan, Heartbeat, Eddie Vass, and David Stilwell all take this subject very seriously. Do you believe there's a devil? What about evil spirits? Are they fact or fantasy? What we believe affects the way we behave. Andrea believes in God, and this belief was reflected when we asked her some basic questions about her view of the world.
I can't honestly believe that I sort of crawled out of a river or something and gradually evolved into a human being. I think it is much more credible to say that I was created by someone. I believe that I'm a mixture of body, soul and spirit. All the experiences that happen to us throughout our lives affect the kind of person that we end up being. I think you know deep down inside when you're doing things that are right and when you're doing things that are wrong. I suppose it's what you call your conscience. When we die, there's a part of us that actually lives on, call it your spirit or your soul. I think there has to be more to life than what we actually see on the earth. And I think if I thought that reality was just what I want for my life, my own plans, my ambitions, I'd be quite depressed because you don't know that it's all going to be the success that you'd hope it would be. I think really at the end of the day, reality would actually be to know God who loved us and really cares about us and to actually understand his purpose for our lives. I think that reality really is knowing God.
Rodney Matthews is an artist whose work can be seen on record sleeves, calendars and posters all over the world. He lives in North Wales. Rodney's pictures often provoke people into thinking about their own world view of life, things seen and unseen. He showed us his latest poster, showing the relationship between God and his creation. God, holy angels, Satan, fallen angels, and evil spirits, all normally invisible to the human eye, appear visible alongside mankind, animals, and the rest of creation. Spiritism, fortune-telling, witchcraft, and Satanism are results of the influence of these fallen angels and evil spirits. Getting involved can open up doorways for spirit beings to harm and oppress us. God himself dealt with this danger to mankind 2,000 years ago. He came to this world in the person of Jesus Christ and broke the power of Satan, death, and sin on the cross at Calvary. In Christ's victory, there is the promise of freedom from the harmful effects of contact with the occult.
Do you know your birth sign? Do you follow the stars? Believing in bad luck and superstition. Predictions in your horoscope beginning to come true. Without it, you don't want to make decisions.
There was one day when I was coming down the corridors with a friend of mine, Sarah, and as we walked past the cloakrooms, there was a little bunch of girls, different girls, who were in there, and they were like reading the Lord's Prayer backwards, and it was very, very dark where they were. They'd kind of made sure that there was no light coming in, and they had like a few candles around, and that, because of the fact that I'd always been brought up in church, I knew that the Lord's Prayer was right, so the fact that they were saying it backwards to me was, hey, I don't want to go near this.
Ouija boards in themselves are very dangerous things. You cannot contact the spirits of dead people. What happens when you use a Ouija board is that you open up doorways into the lower spiritual realms where demonic beings, evil spirits exist. This might seem like fantasy stuff, but it actually happens. And once those doorways are open, the people using the Ouija boards themselves are opening themselves up to mental disturbances by the forces that they unleash.
Many films and videos today major on horror, sex, fantasy, and the demonic. Paul Benison recalls an incident from his work among young people.
Talking to a young man recently, he'd watched from the age of 12 or 13 a number of occult-based films like The Exorcist and The Omen. they had had a severe effect on his life, and he'd lived in fear and had recurring nightmares for an extended period of time. As he'd grown up, he'd recognised that he didn't want to live life that way, but he also knew that he couldn't do anything about it himself. And he recognised too that the only way out for him was to turn to God. And as we began to talk through the fears and talk through the nightmares and the influence they'd had, I just suggested that we sat down and pray. And as we did that and asked God to come in and to remove those fears, it was as though a hand got hold of him by the throat and tried to strangle him. And as we talked and as we prayed, the fear that he had was accentuated because he realised that Satan had actually influenced him far more than he'd realised. And that is Satan's way. You get sucked in and think you're in control and think you're able to cope with and handle the things that you've got yourself into. But when the crunch comes, you recognise that you're in much deeper than you ever realised. But we continued to pray, and as we asked God to free him, so that hand released its grip, and he was free.
Come into my parlour, set the spider to the fly. There are many pleasures, do you want to try? But a welcome turns to terror when you open up your mind. There are powers of darkness responding to your cry. Is anybody there? Is anybody there? Is anybody there? Is anybody there? Is anybody there?
When Sarah and I went down to the other end of the playing fields under the willow tree to see what was going on there, they weren't doing anything that I would recognise was wrong, because they weren't like reading the Lord's Prayer backwards or anything. But there was a crowd of them, and there was a girl lying down, and then they had like 6 people on either side. They were just kind of concentrating. They had their eyes closed and they were concentrating, and they were basically just lifting her up. Okay, which I now know is levitation, okay, but I didn't know that's what it was at the time. To me, it was just kind of magic, and magic was never evil or wrong or anything.
And it wasn't long before Carolyn found herself not simply watching, but taking part.
And so my friend Sarah, she bent down. It was me that was going to be over her. And everybody was linked around us, and and she did the breathing and everything else, and then she went out. And it was me, and I really started to concentrate on her. And then immediately I was just like looking at her face, and her face just really started to distort. And you could see she was like really having problems. And I just thought, God, what is it I have done? What is it I have got involved in? And it really unnerved me. And I started to be frightened for my friend because I didn't know what was happening to her. And so I really prayed, and I was like, God, I'm really sorry, and, help Sarah, don't let anything horrible happen to Sarah, help her. And the more I prayed, the worse she got, and then the group that was around me just kind of like really turned on me, and they were really annoyed with me, and look what you've done to her, and, and it's all your fault, it's all gone wrong. And I was like, oh no, this is my pal, you don't even go around with her, okay, I'm not going to hurt her on purpose. And there was my poor mate, who was kind of drunk. She looked like she was drunk. She couldn't stand up straight. She couldn't focus, nothing. And that really frightened me to see that kind of reaction in her. When I look back, it had a big effect on my life. It had a real significant effect on me mentally, emotionally. It affected me full stop. It messed me up. And I can see that now. Even just that small involvement that I had.
There are many dangers attached to getting involved in the occult. Some of them obvious, some of them not so obvious. The obvious ones are the nightmares the children suffer fairly immediately after getting involved at school with the Ouija boards and so forth. The less obvious ones are the depressions and the family breakdowns that can come years later, but still stem from those experiences they had at those young years. But an even more fundamental problem is that it actually denies them access to God. God hates these people.
Paul Heather was once deeply involved in astrology and provided his friends with birth charts and horoscopes.
I recall going down Charing Cross Road and walking into this bookshop and seeing this beautifully illustrated book on how to become an astrologer, how to do it. And I bought it and took it home and began to study it. And when I get hold of something, I don't do it lightly, I really get into it. And I really got into astrology and learned how to do it. But having established a chart for a person, from where they're born and when they were born, there's a need to interpret it. So I ended up buying all these books, a whole library of books on astrology and how to interpret the signs and work out a person's personality from the information you have. I got to the place with astrology where I began to objectively question the fruit of it, what's the point of it? And I began to realise that it was a bit like the teacup, worshipping the teapot because the teapot was filling it up. But the teacup wasn't actually seeing the hand which was holding the teapot. Here I was giving credence to stars and planets without actually seeing the hand that actually put them into that position in the first place.
My name's Judith Dawson, and I'm a child abuse consultant from Nottinghamshire Social Services. In that job, I spend most of my time having to help my department respond to families who've had problems, particularly involving the abuse of children. Over the past 7 or 8 years, social services departments have had to come to terms with the fact that children have not only been physically abused within their families, but they've also been sexually abused. And that's been a very painful thing to get used to. We've had to be taken beyond belief, because what we've learned is that children are not only sexually abused in some families, but that they're also ritualistically abused. That means that we have learned that some families, some adults, get involved with satanic groups whose main aim is to destroy everything that is good, everything that's good about human life and human values. And one particular target in that would be that they should hurt and defile children. As you're probably aware, Christ said, "Touch not one hair of this child's head." Satanists believe that they should do the opposite of that.
People like us Christian ministers are having to counsel youngsters time and time again. They get involved with the soft stuff, the horoscopes, the tarot cards, the Ouija boards. It draws them into this power that they don't understand, they can't control. And suddenly, they're lost. Their personalities disintegrate, and they go from bad to worse, and they lose the ability to be people in their own right and to make choices. And I'd just say to youngsters today, don't start on that path. Once you start on it, it's a very slippery slope that ends in disaster.